Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for staying, and I hope you're enjoying the day as much as I am. The default future for the planet is both urbanized and rather dark. So the question before us is, how can we have the former, that is urbanization, without the latter, that is calamity? Cities are growing fast, especially in the global south, and are increasingly home for humanity. And they're essential to any positive future for the planet and for humanity. And yet they face, or rather at the coalface, of all kinds of wicked problems, overlapping challenges. Obviously of climate change, of the Anthropocene, as we've heard now several times. Also of inequality, and not just of wealth, but also of power, which fuels various forms of conflict and even war. And last and by no means least, ongoing digital disruption, which is creating increasingly disembodied, technologically intermediated social relations, and potentially even forms of human obsolescence and hackability. Now, given the underlying social and technological dynamics behind these problems, unfortunately, very often, even the solutions to them tend to simply fuel even further the problems, more mute relations to the world in positive feedback loops. There's only one response to this, which is ethics. Ethics, as Schweitzer tells us, is the heart of civilization and its advance. And it alone can turn us back from the abyss. There is no substitute. But as Schweitzer also has conclusively demonstrated, ethics cannot be derived from looking ever more closely at the nature of the world and the facts of the matter. That presumption, though, is the underpinning of Western thought and material progress, at least through the modern period, if not through our entire history. But it's failed again and again, and it's failing actively now at global and planetary scale. This perspective is the common sense orientation to the world that we have, of a literal realism of a world out there. But what happens if we actually look at what adopting that perspective actually does? By including and starting from ourselves and our own experience. What we find is that, first, this approach tends only to focus on the problems and to draw our attention to those problems. Secondly, focusing on a world out there locks us into a specific, often useful, but limited perspective on the world, and one that de facto excludes the living, self-conscious, and ethical human being that each of us is. So what it tends to do is to reaffirm and underpin more mute relations to the world. In a world of increasingly powerful but unpredictably responsive, technologically intermediated social relations, then, we need a new perspective, a new approach for a new ethics. But simply asking this question of putting ourselves in the picture already opens up a different perspective. In particular, it brings to attention a realm of reality that is generally neglected altogether, which is that everything that we can know or experience or act upon happens in mind. And when I say mind, I don't mean your thoughts or my thoughts. I mean the heart, body, mind, or the chitta, as it's called in Sanskrit, for instance. If we attend to this, we find, of course, it's no surprise that our action in the world tends to be building societies of ever greater alienation, because the absence of the subject is there from the beginning and built in. What happens if we shift to this perspective instead? What do we find? We find that my relations or your relations to the world, and then indeed the world that is emergent from acting on that basis, is in many ways, crucially, self-manifesting or participatory. That is, it expresses the disposition that we have already adopted. Moreover, I can only experience non-mute relations to the world, or specific elements of it, where first I experience, with some degree of self-awareness, myself as a subject of experience. This means that this kind of attention, this kind of phenomenological inquiry, or mindfulness of our bodies, our senses, our emotions, our thoughts, is a prerequisite of a growing capacity for actually having resonant relationships, resonant relations with the world, as and when they arise. Moreover, when such moments arise, we can begin to experience how these lead to positive feedback loops of growing meaningfulness and connection with the world. Hence, feeling more attuned and more capable of resonance, hence feeling more confident in our self-efficacy, and so on and so forth, then going back into the world and acting on that basis. That is, in other words, of constant loops of decentering in our connection to others, and then recentering in an expanding field of awareness. And this is precisely, therefore, to cultivate a new perspectival ethics of reverence for life. So I want to suggest to you that the coalface that the city is regarding these challenges of the Anthropocene and the technosphere are primarily problems about who is relating to the world and how. It is not a problem about the world or in the world, nor even is it primarily an issue of our relationship to the world. And this leads, therefore, to two claims about the future of the city. And the best way that I want to suggest that we can think about it. On the one hand, what we need is that the goal for cities is for them to be resonant, places of resonance. But equally, we need cities specifically behind that project of resonance. So let's just look at those 2 points in turn. First of all, these positive feedback loops that I've already mentioned, they're clearly specific to an individual and reflective of the sociological conditions that that person finds themselves in. And those conditions are not just background or context, but they are constitutive of that person and their experience, and indeed of their tendency or capacity for feeling resonance or muteness with the world. But if we start to look at the world in this light, the social world in this light, we find that this is actually an extremely illuminating perspective anyway, on what is often utterly confounding social change. Because very often that can be best explained by understanding that the action of people and their aggregation into social changes is because people are more or less skillfully relentlessly pursuing resonance or fleeing muteness in their relationship to the world. We also find that this resonance is, it can never be guaranteed. We can't build a society that guarantees that you will be resonant. Neither can we find one which will always, therefore, banish alienation. Yet it is in that sensitivity to the absence of resonance that comes from alienation. So this is the creation of an anti-utopian, phenomenological and ethical but practical critique of society. This is also, though, a very different project to the mainstream and default way in which we think about society at the moment. This is usually in terms of a realist sociology, exploring the distribution, very often unjust and unequal, of resources. But this approach tends only ever to highlight the problems, many as they are, and with often only the most cursory attention paid to what can be done instead. More importantly, and more fundamentally still, though, is that this approach tends actively to contribute to the incubation within people thinking that way of first-person relations to the world that will tend to create precisely the worst outcomes in the world because, again, they have presumed the subjectlessness of society. So if the goal for cities is that we need resonance, with the unfamiliarity of that term key, and where we must admit that we don't actually know what the good city looks like. On the other hand, we equally need for that project of resonance to be specifically delivered by cities, because there is no realistic or realizable positive future arising in timely fashion and at sufficient scale to tackle these global problems without this organizational form and supreme innovation of the city taking on that challenge. So I want to suggest there are but two options before us in every moment going forward. On the one hand, we can continue with simply adopting a perspective of realism. This might be complacent business as usual, but it might also be a solution-focused perspective on the world out there. My fear is that regardless of our perspective, either of those, business as usual or solution-focused, they will tend rather to simply create different variations of a similar future, one of digital authoritarianism, one of securitized and polarized cities, one of a global underclass of redundant humans. Or we can try something entirely different. Only if we start to have cities that are inhabited by denizens self-consciously curating optimal conditions of resonant relations to the world, to each other, to the immediate built environment, to nature and the planet, to history, to the cosmos, and both in themselves as self-responsible individuals, but also in our communities, in our workplaces, in our associations, in our public spheres. Only then can we challenge and even potentially harness what is now the unleashed Promethean possibilities and the alienation of these new technologies that are rising so fast within society. This feels to me to be the best way towards a collective and urbanized planetary flourishing. Thank you.